The smell of roasting pecans is a heavy, sweet thing. It settles into the floorboards, weaves itself into the curtains, and after 40 years, it simply becomes the scent of home. My name is Evelyn Sterling. I am 68 years old, and if you were to stand on my back porch and look out toward the horizon, all you would see are the neat, sweeping rows of the pecan orchard my husband Arthur planted with his own 2 hands. Arthur used to say that a pecan tree teaches you patience. You plant it knowing you might not see it at its tallest, but you nurture it anyway, trusting the roots to hold. He passed away 3 years ago, leaving me with this sprawling Texas estate, a house entirely too quiet, and a heart that still expects to hear his heavy boots dropping by the back door every evening at 6. I miss him with a quiet, steady ache, but I am not a fragile woman. You do not survive 40 Texas summers working an orchard by being fragile. My life had settled into a comfortable, if solitary, rhythm. I had my garden, my book club with ladies I've known since the Reagan administration, and the deep, abiding peace of my own home. My son Harrison lived up in Austin, about 40 miles away. At 42, he was a mid-level manager at one of those shiny tech companies that always seem to be restructuring. We had a cordial relationship. He called on Sundays, visited on major holidays, and always brought an expensive, impersonal bottle of wine. I loved him fiercely, of course, but I wasn't blind to his flaws. Harrison had always liked the idea of wealth more than the work it took to build it. Things began to change in the early spring. The visits, which used to be predictably rare, suddenly became frequent. And he rarely came alone anymore. His wife, Jessica, was a woman who always looked as though she were late for a very important appointment at a country club. She wore immaculate neutral tones, carried handbags that cost more than my first car, and had a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Jessica tolerated me. She tolerated the farmhouse, the dust from the orchard, and the fact that I served iced tea from a glass pitcher instead of a crystal decanter. But lately, her tolerance had shifted into a tight, focused kind of attention. It started with the small things, the kind of things you brush off because acknowledging them feels petty. "Evelyn, sweetheart," Jessica said one afternoon, running a manicured finger over the mantelpiece. "Have you ever thought about how much upkeep this place requires? It must be exhausting for you all alone out here." "I have a groundskeeper for the orchard, Jessica," I replied smoothly, wiping my hands on my apron. "And the house and I understand each other perfectly." Harrison chimed in, his voice taking on that smooth, practiced tone he used when he was trying to sell a concept. "Mom, she just means we worry. You're isolated. If you fell, or if the power went out, we just want to make sure you're safe." I let it go. Children worry. It's their prerogative. But the worry soon morphed into something that felt distinctly like an appraisal. They would walk through the rooms, their eyes lingering on the original hardwood floors, the vaulted ceilings Arthur had built, the antique mahogany dining table. I began to feel less like a mother hosting her children and more like a tenant showing a property to prospective buyers. Then, the gaslighting began. I didn't recognize it for what it was at first. When you are pushing 70, society has already primed you to doubt your own mind. You forget a name, and you immediately wonder if it's the beginning of the end. Harrison and Jessica knew this. They weaponized it with terrifying precision. It started on a Tuesday. I had placed my reading glasses on the kitchen island, right next to the fruit bowl. I knew exactly where they were because I had just used them to read the water bill. I went to the laundry room to switch over a load of towels, and when I came back, the glasses were gone. I searched for 20 minutes. I found them finally tucked inside the pantry, sitting inexplicably on top of a box of baking soda. Harrison had stopped by briefly that morning to drop off some mail that had been misdirected to his old P.O. box. When I mentioned the glasses to him over the phone later, laughing at my own apparent absent-mindedness, his silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Mom," he said softly, too softly, "are you sure you're feeling all right? You've been doing things like this a lot lately." "Doing what, Harrison? Misplacing my glasses? I've been doing that since I was 40. No, Mom, putting things in strange places. Last week you swore you paid the electric bill, but remember I had to help you find the late notice? I'm concerned." A cold prickle touched the back of my neck. I had paid the electric bill. I remembered writing the check. But when Harrison had come over, the checkbook was in the wrong drawer, the stub was blank, and the late notice was sitting right on the counter. I had felt so foolish, so terribly old in that moment, thanking him for catching my mistake. The incidents escalated through April. My gardening shears disappeared from the shed and ended up in the hall closet. The thermostat, which I kept strictly at 72 degrees, would suddenly be cranked up to 80, leaving me waking up in a sweat, wondering if I had lost my mind in the middle of the night. A pot of soup I had left simmering on low was turned off completely, ruining the broth. Every time, Harrison or Jessica happened to be there to witness my confusion. "Oh, Evelyn," Jessica would sigh, placing a hand on my arm with a look of profound theatrical pity. "It's so hard getting older. My grandmother started doing the exact same things just before we had to move her into a facility. It's nothing to be ashamed of." I began to doubt myself. I started writing down everything I did in a little notebook. Turned off stove at 2 p.m. Put keys in ceramic bowl. Locked back door. I was terrified. The mind is a fragile sanctuary, and to feel the walls of it crumbling is a profound and lonely horror. I wept one night, sitting in Arthur's old leather armchair, clutching my notebook, praying that I wasn't losing the very essence of who I was. But I am Arthur Sterling's widow, and I do not surrender easily. The turning point came on the third Sunday in May. I had invited them for a roast chicken dinner. I spent the afternoon cooking, carefully checking my notebook, ensuring every burner was off, every utensil in its place. I was determined to prove my competence. After dinner, as I poured coffee, Harrison cleared his throat. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, glossy folder. The cover featured a stock photo of a smiling, silver-haired couple walking through a manicured garden. The gold-embossed letters read, "Silver Creek, Premier Senior Living." "Mom, sit down," Harrison said, his voice adopting that unbearable managerial patience. I remained standing, the coffee pot warm in my hand. "What is this, Harrison?" Jessica leaned forward, her eyes bright with an eagerness she couldn't quite conceal. "Evelyn, Harrison and I have been doing a lot of research. We've found a place. It's absolutely gorgeous. They have a golf course, daily social activities, 24-hour nursing staff. You wouldn't have to worry about the stairs or the orchard or forgetting things." "I am not moving to a nursing home," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Mom, please," Harrison said, pushing the brochure toward me. "Look at the reality here. You're alone in a 4-bedroom house on 50 acres. You're leaving burners on. You're losing things. It's not safe. We are terrified we're going to get a call one day saying you've hurt yourself." "I haven't left any burners on," I said, my eyes locking onto his. "Not unless someone else touched the dials." Harrison's jaw tightened. A flash of something hard and ugly crossed his face before he smoothed it over with a look of wounded concern. "Mom, paranoia is a symptom. The doctor said—" "What doctor?" I snapped, setting the coffee pot down harder than I intended. The china rattled. "You haven't spoken to my doctor." "We consulted a specialist," Jessica interjected smoothly. "Just generally, of course, to know what to look out for. And Evelyn, you are checking every box. We want you to transition while you still have some independence, before we have to make the decision for you." "Before we have to make the decision for you?" The threat hung in the air, barely veiled by the scent of roast chicken and French roast coffee. They weren't asking. They were informing me of my future. They were laying the groundwork to declare me incompetent. "I am 68 years old, Harrison," I said, drawing myself up to my full height. "I manage the orchard's accounts. I drive. I cook. I live in the house my husband built. I am not going anywhere." The rest of the evening was a tense, quiet affair. They left early, claiming the drive back to Austin was long. When their car taillights disappeared down the driveway, I didn't cry. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the glossy brochure for Silver Creek, and dropped it straight into the trash can. But the fear remained, a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. What if they really did try to force me out? Could they do that? 2 weeks later, the spring storm season hit Texas. It was a torrential downpour, the kind that turns the sky purple-black and rattles the window panes in their frames. Harrison and Jessica had come down for the afternoon to help with some chores, which mostly consisted of Harrison walking the property lines while Jessica sat on my sofa scrolling through her phone. When the storm hit, washing out the main road back to the highway, I offered them the guest room for the night. I couldn't sleep. The thunder was violently loud, shaking the house to its foundation. Around 2 a.m., my throat felt like sandpaper. I slipped out of bed, leaving my slippers behind so I wouldn't make a sound on the hardwood floors, and padded softly down the hallway toward the kitchen for a glass of water. To get to the kitchen, I had to pass the guest room. The door was closed, but the house was old, and the walls were not as thick as they appeared. As I drew near, the thunder rolled away, leaving a pocket of sudden heavy silence in the house. In that silence, I heard Harrison's voice. It wasn't the smooth, practiced tone of the loving son. It was a frantic, raw hiss. "I am trying, Jess. I'm pushing her as fast as I can without making it look obvious." I stopped dead in the hallway. My bare feet felt rooted to the cold wood. I held my breath. "You're not pushing hard enough," Jessica's voice snapped back, sharp as shattered glass. The fake sweetness was entirely gone, replaced by a venomous urgency. "They called again today, Harrison. The margin calls are due. The bank is going to start foreclosure proceedings on our house by the end of next month if we don't produce the capital." "I know," Harrison groaned, the sound full of despair. "I know. The tech stocks tanked. The crypto was a bust. I get it. But she's stubborn. You saw her when I brought up Silver Creek. She dug her heels in." "Then you make her undig them," Jessica hissed. "Harrison, we are drowning in $300,000 of debt. You haven't paid the kids' private school tuition for the fall semester. If my friends at the club find out we're broke, I will never forgive you." "We're not broke, we just have a liquidity problem," he argued weakly. "You have a mother sitting on an estate worth at least $2.5 million, Jessica shot back, her voice vibrating with rage. "She does not need 50 acres and a 4-bedroom house to sit around and mourn your father. We need that equity. You are her only heir. She has to agree to sell it, Jess, or transfer the deed. I can't just take it." "Then you make her think she can't live here anymore." The cruelty in my daughter-in-law's voice was absolute. "Keep moving her things. Keep turning the stove on. We need to document her decline. If she won't sign the power of attorney willingly, we'll get a judge to declare her unfit. I have a doctor in my pocket who will write the evaluation for a fee." A crack of lightning illuminated the hallway, casting long skeletal shadows across the floor. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the gasp that tore up my throat. "I don't like doing this to her," Harrison whispered, and for a fraction of a second, I heard my little boy in that voice. "Do you like the idea of moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in a bad school district?" Jessica demanded. "Do you like the idea of declaring bankruptcy? Because that's what's happening. Make her sign it by the end of the month, Harrison, or I am taking the kids, I am calling my lawyer, and I am leaving you. I will not sink with your ship." There was a long, agonizing silence. Then my son, my only child, the boy I had rocked through fevers and celebrated through graduations, spoke the words that shattered the remaining illusions of my life. "Okay, I'll get the paperwork drawn up this week. We'll push harder. I'll get the deed." I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't get my water. I turned around and walked silently back to my bedroom. I closed the door, locked it quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed in the pitch black. I was not losing my mind. The missing glasses, the altered thermostat, the stove, it was all a manufactured reality. It was a calculated, vicious psychological assault designed to break my confidence, strip me of my independence, and steal my home. And my son was the architect. They thought I was a confused, vulnerable old woman. They thought they were dealing with someone who would quietly fade away into a nursing home out of fear. As I sat there listening to the rain batter the roof Arthur had built to keep us safe, the grief and terror inside me began to crystallize. The tears dried before they could even fall. What replaced them was something entirely different. It was a cold, pure, unadulterated clarity. Harrison and Jessica wanted a war for the pecan orchard. They had chosen their battlefield, and they had chosen their weapons. But they had fundamentally misunderstood their opponent. They had forgotten that before I was a widow, before I was a mother, I was Evelyn Sterling. And nobody, absolutely nobody, takes what is mine. The next morning, the Texas sky was the color of a bruised plum, slowly lightening into a brilliant, washed-clean blue. The storm had passed, leaving behind the rich, loamy scent of wet earth and the sharp fragrance of the pecan trees. I woke up at my usual time, 6 o'clock, and went to the kitchen. I moved with deliberate slowness, making coffee, measuring out flour for buttermilk biscuits. My hands were perfectly steady. The trembling panic of the night before had been completely burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, hard ash. When Harrison and Jessica finally emerged from the guest room, looking rumpled and weary, I greeted them with a warm, slightly vague smile. I set a plate of hot biscuits on the table, alongside homemade peach preserves. "Good morning, you two," I said smoothly, pouring Harrison a cup of black coffee, exactly the way he liked it. The storm knocked out my hydrangeas, but I think the roof held up just fine. Harrison watched me closely over the rim of his mug. He was searching for the bewildered, frightened woman he was trying to manufacture. He was looking for a crack in my foundation. "Did you sleep well, Mom?" he asked, his voice threaded with that forced, gentle concern. "Like a log," I lied effortlessly. Though I couldn't for the life of me remember where I put my slippers last night. I suppose I must have left them by the television. I watched Jessica and Harrison exchange a fleeting, triumphant glance. It made my stomach turn. A physical revulsion so strong I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from slapping the coffee out of my son's hand. But I kept the pleasant, slightly hazy smile on my face. Let them think their psychological warfare was working. Let them believe I was crumbling. A woman who is underestimated is a woman who has the upper hand. As soon as their car rolled down the driveway and disappeared onto the main road, the smile dropped from my face. I had a house to secure, and I had no time to waste. I did not go to the family attorney Arthur and I had used for decades. Old Mr. Henderson was a good man, but he was Harrison's godfather, and in small Texas towns, loyalties can become complicated when money is involved. Instead, I drove 45 minutes out of town to a modest, unassuming brick building in the neighboring county. The brass plaque on the door read, "Constance Hayes, Elder Law and Estate Planning." Constance Hayes was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, a blunt bob of silver hair, and a desk stacked high with manila folders. The office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a scent that somehow reassured me. She did not greet me with pity, and she did not speak to me in that loud, overly enunciated voice people often reserve for anyone over the age of 65. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "what brings you in today?" I sat down in the leather chair opposite her and laid it all out. I told her about the missing items, the gas lighting, the brochure for Silver Creek, and the conversation I had overheard in the dead of night. I spoke without emotion, laying out the facts like pieces of evidence on a table. Constance listened without interrupting, taking quick, precise notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she set her pen down and sighed, a long, heavy sound. "I wish I could tell you this is a unique situation, Evelyn," she said softly. "But it happens every day. Financial elder abuse committed by family members is an epidemic. They use the threat of a competency hearing as a weapon to extort property. It's cruel, but unfortunately, it is very effective against people who don't know their rights." "I am not going to be a victim, Constance," I said, my voice hardening. "This orchard was my husband's life. It is my home. I want to build a fortress around it. I want a living trust, with me as the sole trustee, and I want it ironclad." Constance nodded approvingly. "A revocable living trust is exactly what we need. Once the deed of the house and the orchard is transferred into the trust, it legally belongs to the entity, not to Evelyn Sterling, the individual. Even if Harrison somehow tricked you into signing a power of attorney, or managed to get a shady doctor to declare you unfit, he couldn't touch the property. The trust protects it." "Then let's do it," I said. "Draw up the papers today." "I'll start the paperwork," Constance agreed, turning to her computer. "But first, I need to run a routine title search on the property. We have to make sure the deed is completely clear before we can legally transfer it into the trust. Give me just a few minutes." I sat in the quiet office, listening to the clatter of her keyboard, feeling a profound sense of relief washing over me. I had a plan. I had a champion. I was going to outsmart my own son. But then the typing stopped. I looked up to see Constance frowning at her monitor. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a rubber band. "Constance?" I asked, my heart giving a sudden uncomfortable lurch. "Is something wrong?" She turned the monitor slightly, her expression grim. "Evelyn, did Arthur ever mention a man named Bobby Ray Caldwell?" The name struck me like a physical blow. Bobby Ray Caldwell had been Arthur's best friend in high school, a charismatic, reckless man who was always chasing the next big business scheme, none of which ever panned out. Arthur had loved him like a brother, but I had always distrusted him. "Yes," I said slowly. "Bobby Ray passed away about 5 years ago. Why?" Constance took a deep breath. "Evelyn, there is a cloud on your title. 20 years ago, Arthur co-signed a commercial business loan for Bobby Ray. He used a portion of the orchard's acreage as collateral. The room seemed to tilt. "That's impossible," I whispered. "Arthur would have told me. We owned the property jointly." "In Texas, if the property is a homestead, both spouses usually have to sign," Constance explained gently. "But the acreage he leveraged was classified as agricultural, separate from the primary residence boundaries at the time. Bobby Ray defaulted on the loan a decade ago. A lien was placed on your property. It's just been sitting there, gathering dust in the county records." "How much?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "With 20 years of accrued interest and penalties," Constance read from the screen. $50,000. I closed my eyes. Oh, Arthur. I felt a sudden, fierce flash of anger at my late husband. He had kept this secret to protect me from worry. I knew that. He had probably planned to pay it off quietly after a good harvest, but his heart had given out before he had the chance. His misguided instinct to protect me had just handed my son the exact weapon he needed to destroy me. "I cannot transfer the deed into the living trust while there is an active lien on the property," Constance explained softly. "The title company will reject it. And Evelyn, if Harrison decides to run a title search of his own in preparation to force a sale, he will find this. He could use it as leverage. He could claim you are financially mismanaging the estate and failing to address massive debts, which would bolster his case to have you declared incompetent." "I have to pay it off," I said immediately, "before Harrison finds out." "Do you have $50,000 in liquid assets?" Constance asked. "I have a joint savings account with Harrison," I said, the realization dawning on me. "We set it up years ago for emergencies so he could assist me if I was hospitalized. If I pull $50,000 out of that account, he will get a notification instantly. He'll demand to know what I'm doing. He'll realize I'm making a major financial move." "And if he realizes you're moving money," Constance warned, "he will accelerate his timeline. He'll panic. You'll have a competency hearing scheduled before the week is out." I stared at my hands in my lap. The wedding band Arthur had slipped onto my finger 46 years ago caught the fluorescent light of the office. "I will get the money," I told Constance, my voice dropping to a quiet, absolute vow. "Draw up the trust documents. Have them ready to execute the very minute that lien is cleared. I will buy us the time." Buying time meant returning to the farmhouse and leaning into the most humiliating role I had ever played. It meant transforming myself into the very thing Jessica and Harrison wished me to be. A fading, confused, compliant old woman. Over the next 2 weeks, the psychological warfare in my home intensified, but this time, I was a willing participant in the illusion. I began leaving my car keys in the refrigerator. I would forget the names of Jessica's country club friends when she visited, repeatedly calling her friend Margot Margaret, until Jessica rolled her eyes in exasperated triumph. One afternoon, Jessica came over unannounced. I was on the porch, sipping iced tea, when she pulled up in her gleaming SUV. She walked up the steps, carrying a silver tape measure and a clipboard. "Hi, Evelyn," she said brightly, the fake smile plastered on her face. "I hope you don't mind, but I was in the area and I thought I'd just pop in to measure the living room windows. I saw some beautiful custom drapes online, and I thought they would really brighten up the space for you." I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't measuring for drapes. She was measuring the square footage of the front rooms to verify the floor plan for a real estate listing. The sheer audacity of it, the cold-blooded calculation happening right in my own living room, made my blood boil. But I forced my face to soften into an expression of mild, grateful confusion. "Oh, drapes? That's so sweet of you, Jessica. Arthur always loved the floral ones we have now, but perhaps I am getting a bit tired of them. My memory isn't what it used to be. Are the windows 80 inches or 90? "Don't you worry your head about it, Evelyn," Jessica cooed, her eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction as she pulled the tape measure across my antique Persian rug. "Harrison and I are going to handle everything. You just rest." "You're a good daughter-in-law," I murmured, taking a sip of my tea to hide the grimace of disgust. I watched her meticulously log the dimensions of the room I had decorated, the room where I had hosted every Thanksgiving for 4 decades. "Measure all you want, Jessica," I thought. "You will never own a single inch of this wood." But playing the fool was only half the battle. I still needed $50,000, completely off the grid. That night, after I was sure I was alone, I went into the master bedroom. I pulled the heavy oak dresser away from the wall, my joints protesting the strain, and opened the hidden floor safe Arthur had installed years ago. Inside sat 3 velvet boxes. I carried them to the bed and opened them one by one. The first held a double strand of Akoya pearls, heavy and luminous, which Arthur had bought me in Paris on our 25th anniversary. The second contained a spectacular emerald-cut diamond tennis bracelet, a gift after a particularly historic pecan harvest. The third held an antique platinum and sapphire brooch that had belonged to Arthur's grandmother. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my fingers over the cold, beautiful stones. These were not just pieces of jewelry. They were the physical ledger of my husband's devotion. Every anniversary, every triumph, every apology was recorded in the facets of these gems. Giving them up felt like erasing a part of my own history. A few tears finally fell, hot and silent, dropping onto the velvet lining. But you cannot live inside a diamond. You cannot walk the rows of a pearl necklace in the cool autumn air. If Arthur were here, he would tell me to sell them without a second thought. The land is the legacy, Evie. I could almost hear his deep voice saying in the quiet room. The rest is just rocks. The next morning, telling Harrison I was going to a distant nursery to look for rare hydrangeas, I drove 3 hours east to Houston. I bypassed the flashy jewelry stores in the malls and found a discreet high-end estate buyer located in a secure high-rise downtown. The appraiser, an elegant man with a jeweler's loupe and a quiet demeanor, examined the pieces for a long time. "These are exceptional, Mrs. Sterling," he said softly, looking up at me. "The pearls alone are museum quality. Are you certain you wish to liquidate?" "I am certain," I said, keeping my posture straight and my voice devoid of the heartbreak I felt. "They have served their purpose." He wrote me a cashier's check for $52,000. It was less than what they were insured for, but it was enough. I walked out of that building feeling lighter, stripped of my adornments, but armed for war. I drove straight to the bank holding the lien on my property. It took nearly 2 hours of wrangling with a stunned branch manager who couldn't understand why a woman was paying off a 20-year-old debt in a single cashier's check. But by 3 o'clock that afternoon, I had the satisfaction of a release of lien document stamped in heavy red ink across my file. From the bank, I drove directly to Constance Hayes' office. I walked past her receptionist and laid the stamped release document on Constance's desk. She looked at it, then looked up at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Evelyn," she said, her voice filled with profound respect, "you are a terrifying woman." "I am a mother defending her home," I replied, sitting down. "The land is clear. Now, Constance, execute the trust. Lock it all down." She pushed a thick stack of documents toward me, handing me a heavy gold pen. I signed my name over and over again, each signature a brick in the wall I was building around the pecan orchard. When the final page was notarized, the deed to 442 Oak Creek Road ceased to belong to me. It belonged to the Sterling Family Living Trust, and not even God himself could force me to sell it without my consent. I drove home as the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of orange and gold. The shadows of the pecan trees stretched long across the driveway as I pulled in. The house stood exactly as it had that morning, quiet and resolute. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and waited. The trap was set. The fortress was built. Now all I had to do was let Harrison and Jessica walk blindly into the execution. The time for playing the confused, forgetful old woman was coming to an end. Soon they were going to meet the real Evelyn Sterling. June arrived in Texas with a heavy, suffocating heat that settled over the pecan orchard like a woolen blanket. The cicadas began their rhythmic, deafening thrum in the branches, a sound that usually brought me peace. This year, however, it felt like a ticking clock. With the Sterling Family Living Trust legally binding and safely tucked away in a bank vault, my home was utterly secure. Harrison could not sell the property. He could not leverage it. He could not touch a single blade of grass on my 50 acres. But he didn't know that yet, and until the final curtain fell on this ugly little play, I had to keep up the charade. The psychological toll of pretending to lose your mind is far heavier than one might expect. You have to monitor every word, ensuring you speak with just enough hesitation. You have to manufacture physical vulnerability, moving a little slower, staring blankly at the television screen when they are watching you. But beneath the fragile exterior I presented to my son and daughter-in-law, my mind was sharper, clearer, and more ruthless than it had been in my entire life. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my carefully constructed facade almost shattered. Jessica had stopped by under the guise of bringing me some fresh peaches from the farmer's market. In reality, she was doing what she always did, snooping. I was in the kitchen, carefully washing the fruit while she hovered in the living room. My leather handbag was sitting on the armchair where I had carelessly dropped it after returning from the grocery store. I hadn't zipped it entirely shut. "Evelyn, did you drop a receipt?" Jessica's voice rang out. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked into the living room. Jessica was standing by the armchair, holding a small slip of white paper. Her perfectly manicured fingernails pinched the edges of it tightly. Even from across the room, I recognized the heavy, cream-colored paper. It was the retainer receipt from Constance Hayes, Elder Law and Estate Planning. I had meant to file it away in the hidden safe that morning, but in my haste to get to the store, I had simply shoved it into my wallet. It must have fluttered out when I pulled out my reading glasses. A cold spike of pure adrenaline shot through my veins. This was it. The entire plan could unravel right here on the antique Persian rug. I watched Jessica's eyes dart across the text on the receipt. Her brow furrowed, and then her gaze snapped up to meet mine. The mask of the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law was gone. What looked back at me was a woman calculating a threat. "Evelyn," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Why do you have a receipt for $500 from an elder law attorney? Are you in some sort of legal trouble?" My mind raced through 1,000 possible excuses, discarding each one in a fraction of a second. If I feigned ignorance, she wouldn't believe me. If I got defensive, it would signal guilt. I needed a lie so brilliant, so perfectly tailored to her specific brand of greed, that she would swallow it whole without chewing. I forced a look of flustered embarrassment onto my face. I reached up and touched my cheek, letting my shoulders slump. "Oh dear," I murmured, stepping forward and gently taking the receipt from her stiff fingers. "I suppose the cat is out of the bag. I wanted it to be a surprise." "A surprise?" Jessica repeated, her eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. "What kind of surprise requires an estate lawyer, Evelyn?" "Well," I said, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh, playing the part of a weary grandmother thinking only of her legacy. "I was watching a program on television the other night about the estate tax. It terrified me, Jessica. The government coming in and taking nearly half of everything Arthur and I worked for just to process probate? I couldn't bear the thought of it." I paused, letting the fear of lost money sink into her hyper-materialistic brain. I saw her throat swallow nervously. "So," I continued, dropping my voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "I went to see Miss Hayes. I'm having her draft a new will. I am going to bypass you and Harrison entirely." Jessica literally gasped, taking a physical step back, her face turning a blotchy red. "Bypass us? Evelyn, you can't." "I am leaving everything, 100% of the estate, in a direct generation-skipping trust for little Leo," I interrupted smoothly, invoking the name of my 8-year-old grandson. "Miss Hayes explained that if I leave the property directly to my grandson, with Harrison as the legal custodian until Leo turns 25, we can avoid the heaviest of the inheritance taxes. I just want to make sure my beautiful grandson's future is completely secure and that the government doesn't get a dime of Arthur's hard work." I watched the lie detonate behind her eyes. I watched the anger and panic instantly morph into a dizzying rush of pure, unadulterated greed. Leaving it to Leo with Harrison as custodian meant Harrison would still control the asset. It meant the money was staying in her immediate household. It meant she had won the lottery, and she didn't even have to share it with Harrison's creditors, because a minor's trust is notoriously difficult for a parent's creditors to pierce. "Oh," Jessica breathed, the venom completely vanishing from her tone. A wide, genuine, terrifying smile spread across her face. "Oh, Evelyn, that is so incredibly thoughtful of you. Leo will be so well taken care of. Harrison will be thrilled." "Well, you mustn't tell him," I chided gently, tapping her arm. "The paperwork takes a few weeks to finalize. I want to present it to him when it's all officially signed and sealed." "Our little secret?" "Absolutely," Jessica promised, her eyes practically glittering with dollar signs. "Our little secret." She left shortly after, practically floating to her car. I locked the front door, leaned my back against the heavy wood, and let out a long, shaky breath. I had bought myself a reprieve, but I knew the nature of the beast I was dealing with. The lie would pacify Jessica, but it would not pacify Harrison's desperate creditors. A will only pays out when the testator is dead. Harrison needed cash now, and as I stood in my quiet hallway, I realized the terrible corner I had just painted my son into. By telling Jessica the money was locked up for little Leo upon my death, Harrison would realize that waiting for me to naturally pass away or waiting for a will to be finalized was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had to take control of the estate before that imaginary will was signed. He had to strike immediately. 3 days later, the storm broke. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at the mahogany dining table, peacefully sorting through some old photographs, when I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. A moment later, the front door opened. Harrison still had his key, a privilege I was about to permanently revoke. He didn't call out a greeting. The heavy, hurried thud of his footsteps echoed in the foyer. But he wasn't alone. I heard the scuff of 2 other pairs of shoes. I remained seated as the head of the table, folding my hands over a photograph of Arthur. Harrison walked into the dining room. His face was pale, tight with anxiety, his hair slightly disheveled. Behind him stood 2 men I had never seen before. One was a nervous-looking younger man clutching a leather briefcase to his chest. The other was a man in his late 50s wearing a slightly rumpled suit, carrying a black medical bag. He had the oily, overly confident aura of a man who makes his living exploiting the desperate. "Harrison," I said calmly, "who are these gentlemen? It's not polite to bring guests without calling first." "Mom," Harrison said. His voice was trembling, though whether from guilt or sheer panic I couldn't tell. He walked around the table and stood near my chair, trying to project an air of sorrowful authority. "Mom, we need to have a very serious conversation. Please just stay calm." "I am perfectly calm," I replied, my voice as cool and smooth as the iced tea in the pitcher beside me. "I am waiting for an introduction." Harrison swallowed hard. "This is Mr. Davies. He's a notary public. And this is Dr. Eris Thorne. He's a specialist, a psychiatrist." The silence in the dining room was absolute. I looked from the trembling notary to the sleazy doctor, and finally to my son. The ultimate betrayal had arrived, delivered right to my dining room table. He was going to try and declare me legally incompetent on the spot. "A psychiatrist," I repeated, tasting the word. "I see. Have I suddenly developed a need for psychiatric care between breakfast and lunch?" Dr. Thorne stepped forward, putting on a face of practiced, synthetic empathy. "Mrs. Sterling, your son has expressed deep, profound concern for your cognitive well-being. He's documented several alarming incidents over the past few months. Forgetfulness, paranoia, dangerous behavior around the house. It is my professional duty to conduct a preliminary evaluation today to determine if you are a danger to yourself." "And if I refuse this little evaluation?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "Mom, please don't make this difficult," Harrison pleaded, leaning in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed sickeningly with the sour tang of his sweat. "If you refuse, Dr. Thorne will have to file an affidavit with the state. They'll drag you into a courtroom. A judge will force you into a facility. It will be public, Mom. It will be humiliating." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, stapled document, laying it on the table over Arthur's photograph. "I don't want to do that to you," Harrison whispered, playing the role of the tragic, self-sacrificing son. "I want to protect your dignity. If you just sign this general durable power of attorney right now, Mr. Davies is here to notarize it. You won't have to go through an evaluation. You won't have to go to court. You can just rest. I will take over the legal and financial burden. I'll make sure you're taken care of." It was a masterclass in extortion. Sign away your rights, your home, and your wealth voluntarily, or we will legally strip you of your humanity and lock you in a ward. I looked down at the power of attorney document. It gave Harrison complete, unchecked control over my bank accounts, my medical decisions, and my real estate. With one stroke of a pen, he could sell the pecan orchard tomorrow morning. I looked up at Harrison. I searched his eyes, looking for any trace of the boy who used to scrape his knees climbing these very trees, the boy who used to cry when he found a bird with a broken wing. I found nothing but the frantic, hollow gaze of a man drowning in his own greed. The grief that had been sitting in my chest for months finally crystallized into something hard, cold, and diamond-sharp. The game of pretend was over. "You want to talk about my cognitive well-being, Dr. Thorne?" I asked, my voice suddenly dropping its feigned fragility. The tremor was gone. My posture straightened, my spine locking into place. Dr. Thorne blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in my demeanor. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling. As I said, the documented incidents. Let's talk about documentation, I interrupted, my voice cracking through the room like a bullwhip. I reached down to the heavy oak sideboard next to my chair. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, glossy folder bearing the official crest of the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. I dropped it onto the mahogany table with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Since you are so concerned about my mental acuity, Harrison," I said, locking eyes with my son, "you will be thrilled to know that I took it upon myself to undergo a comprehensive 3-day cognitive and psychiatric evaluation last week." Harrison's face went completely, devastatingly white. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast he looked as though he might faint. "What?" he choked out. I opened the folder. I was evaluated by Dr. Sterling Vance, the chief of neurology, and Dr. Elizabeth Klein, the head of geriatric psychiatry. Perhaps you know them, Dr. Thorne. They are highly respected by the Texas Medical Board. Unlike some people. Dr. Thorne shifted his weight nervously, his sleazy confidence evaporating into the thick summer air. I am familiar with their work, yes." "Wonderful," I said cheerfully, flipping to the final page of the report. "Then you will respect their conclusive findings. According to UT Southwestern, I possess the cognitive function, memory retention, and executive reasoning of a healthy woman 15 years my junior. I scored in the top 1 percentile for my demographic. The official notarized conclusion is that I am completely, unequivocally sound of mind and capable of managing all my personal, medical, and financial affairs without restriction." I slid the report across the table until it bumped against Harrison's fraudulent power of attorney. And I continued, folding my hands back together, feeling the absolute intoxicating rush of total control. "We have a bit of a conflict here. On one side, we have the chief of neurology at the finest research hospital in the state declaring me exceptionally competent. On the other side, we have a doctor who makes house calls with a notary in tow, ready to declare me incompetent without asking me a single medical question, based entirely on the hearsay of a man desperate to pay off his margin calls." Harrison flinched as if I had struck him across the face. "Mom, how do you know about the margin calls?" I ignored him, fixing my gaze entirely on the hired gun. "Dr. Thorne," I said, and my voice was no longer that of a mother. It was the voice of a woman who owned 50 acres of Texas dirt and knew exactly how to bury a snake. "I know exactly what this is. This is a coordinated attempt to extort an elderly woman of her property under the fraudulent threat of medical institutionalization. I have the business card of an investigator at the Texas Medical Board on my refrigerator. I also have the number of the district attorney." The doctor physically recoiled. "If you do not take your bag, walk out my front door, and lose my address permanently," I promised him, my voice practically humming with lethal intent, "I will personally make sure you never legally prescribe so much as an aspirin in the state of Texas again. I will ruin you." Dr. Thorne didn't say a single word. He didn't try to defend himself. He looked at the UT Southwestern logo on the table, turned on his heel, and fast walked out of the dining room. A second later, the front door slammed shut. The young notary, clutching his briefcase to his chest like a shield, looked terrified. I was just hired off an app to stamp a signature," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I don't want any trouble, ma'am." "Then I suggest you follow the doctor, Mr. Davies," I said politely. He practically sprinted out the door. And then there were two. Harrison stood frozen by the table. The silence in the house rushed back in, heavier and thicker than before. He looked at the psychiatric report, then looked at me, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that he had not been playing me. I had been playing him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I was just trying to help. I swear." "Do not insult my intelligence, Harrison," I said coldly, standing up from the chair. "I heard you and Jessica that night during the storm. I know about your debts. I know about the misting glasses and the stove. I know every single filthy, deceitful thing you did to try and break my mind so you could steal your father's legacy." "Mom, please," he begged, a tear finally spilling over his eyelashes, tracing a path down his pale cheek. "We're going to lose our house. I'm going to lose everything." "You already have," I told him, the finality of the words ringing like a bell tolling the end of an era. "Pick up your fraudulent paperwork, Harrison. Put your keys to this house on the table, and get out." He stared at me, opening his mouth to plead again, but he saw the look in my eyes. The Evelyn Sterling who would make excuses for her little boy was dead. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the brass key, and set it gently on top of Arthur's photograph. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house he had grown up in. I stood alone in the dining room. I picked up the key, its metal cold against my palm. The first battle was won, and the house was safe. But as I looked out the window at the sprawling pecan orchard, a dark thought settled over me. A man as desperate as Harrison, manipulated by a woman as greedy as Jessica, does not simply walk away after one defeat. They were going to try something else. And next time, they wouldn't use a doctor. They would use a sledgehammer. The heat of July in Texas is not something you endure. It is something you survive. The air shimmers over the asphalt, and the pecan trees seem to hold their breath, waiting for the dusk. For 3 weeks following the disastrous showdown in my dining room, the silence from Austin was absolute. No phone calls, no text messages, no apologies. I spent my days tending to my roses, walking the orchard lines with the groundskeeper, and systematically removing every trace of Harrison and Jessica's influence from the house. I threw away the glossy Silver Creek brochure. I changed the locks on every door, securing heavy deadbolt brass where the old tumblers used to be. The house felt lighter, purged of the deceit that had coated its walls like invisible soot. I had won. The Sterling Family Living Trust was impregnable, and my medical competency was established beyond any legal reproach. I allowed myself to believe the war was over. It is a dangerous thing, letting your guard down when the enemy is silent. Silence is rarely a retreat. It is usually a reloading. The first sign that something was horribly wrong came in the form of a certified letter on a Tuesday morning. The mail carrier, a sweet young man named Toby, who always brought a biscuit for my golden retriever, who had long since passed, handed me the thick manila envelope with a slightly apologetic look. "Needs a signature, Mrs. Sterling," he said softly. I signed, thanking him, and carried the heavy envelope into the kitchen. The return address read, Travis County Clerk's Office, Real Property Records. A strange flutter of unease stirred in my stomach. I grabbed my letter opener, the silver handle cold against my palm, and sliced the envelope open. I pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, stamped with blue ink and official seals. I sat at the island, put on my reading glasses, the ones I had supposedly lost so many times, and began to read. The legal jargon was dense, but the words jumped off the page like sparks from a fire. Grantor, Evelyn Ann Sterling. Grantee, Harrison James Sterling. Instrument, quitclaim deed. Consideration, $10, and other good and valuable consideration. I stopped breathing. The room spun, a sickening, dizzying tilt. According to this document, filed and recorded in the county courthouse just 2 days ago, I had willingly, legally, and permanently signed over the deed to the 442 Oak Creek Road property, the house, the 50 acres, the orchard, to my son, Harrison. My eyes flew to the bottom of the page. There, in stark, undeniable black ink, was my signature, Evelyn A. Sterling. It was perfect. The loop of the Y, the sharp cross of the T, the slight trailing fade at the end of the G. It was exactly how I signed every check, every birthday card, every legal document. Beside it was the heavy embossed seal of a notary public. Thomas Davies, the same terrified young man who had run out of my dining room 3 weeks ago. "No," I whispered to the empty kitchen. No, no, no. This was impossible. I hadn't signed anything. And more importantly, I couldn't have signed anything. The property belonged to the Living Trust. An individual cannot quitclaim a deed they do not technically own. I snatched my cell phone from the counter and dialed Constance Hayes with shaking fingers. She answered on the second ring. "Constance, I need you right now," I said, my voice tight and breathless. "Harrison filed a quitclaim deed. He forged my signature." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, calm down. Take a breath. Read me the date of the execution on the document." I scanned the page, my eyes tracing the lines. "It says it was executed on March 15th. "March 15th, Constance repeated, her voice dropping into a deadly serious register. "March 15th. That was 3 months ago. That was before I had discovered the lien. That was before I had gone to Constance to set up the Living Trust. He backdated it," I realized aloud, the sheer malicious brilliance of the plan hitting me like a physical blow. "He forged a document claiming I gave him the property back in March, and he just held on to it. Since he filed it now, it predates the creation of the trust." "Exactly. Constance said, and I could hear the furious clicking of her keyboard. In the eyes of the county clerk right now, the trust you created is invalid because you technically didn't own the property when you established it. Harrison does. But it's a forgery, I yelled, slamming my hand against the granite counter. I never signed it. That little weasel notary Davies, he stamped it illegally. I believe you, Evelyn, Constance said firmly, but proving a forgery in civil court takes months, sometimes years. You need handwriting experts, depositions, a trial. It's a protracted, agonizing process, and Harrison knows that. Why now? I asked, pacing the length of the kitchen. If he had this back in March, why wait until now to file it? Why go through the charade with the psychiatrist? Because filing a forged deed is a felony, Constance explained grimly. It was his nuclear option. He tried to get you to sign the power of attorney first, because that would have been legal. When you blew up his psychological operation, he panicked. His creditors must be closing in. He had no choice but to drop the bomb. So what do we do? I demanded. He thinks he owns my house, Constance. Evelyn, listen to me very carefully, Constance said, her tone dropping to a low, urgent hum. If Harrison filed this deed, he is moving fast. He isn't going to sit on the property. He's going to try and liquidate it immediately before you can file an injunction. We need to find out if he's listed the property, or worse, if he already has a buyer lined up. I'll call the real estate agencies in town, I said, determination hardening my spine. No, let me do it, Constance instructed. I have access to the MLS back-end systems. You stay put. Lock the doors. Do not call Harrison. Do not let him know you received that notice. We need him to think he's operating in the dark. I hung up the phone and stood in the center of the kitchen, feeling a terrifying, unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. My fortress had been breached from the inside. I walked into the study and opened the heavy antique roll-top desk. I pulled out old tax returns, canceled checks, anniversary cards, anything with my signature on it. I laid them side by side with the forged quitclaim deed. It was a masterpiece. The forgery was so good, it chilled my blood. Harrison had grown up watching me write. He knew the pressure of my pen. But as I stared closer, tracing the ink with a magnifying glass Arthur used to use for stamp collecting, I noticed something. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation at the crest of the capital S. A microscopic pooling of ink where the pen had paused, unnaturally, before completing the curve. It wasn't the fluid motion of a woman who had signed her name 1,000,000 times. It was the careful, deliberate stroke of someone copying a picture. And then I remembered. I remembered Arthur's old study, the one Harrison had cleaned out for me shortly after Arthur's funeral. I remembered the heavy brass contraption Arthur had bought at an estate sale years ago, a vintage auto pen machine. He had used it a few times to sign hundreds of holiday cards for the orchard's clients, programming it with a template of my signature to save my wrist. Harrison hadn't forged my signature by hand. He had stolen the auto pen template. He had used a machine to steal my life. My phone vibrated against the desk, shattering the silence. It was Constance. "Evelyn," she said, and her voice was tighter than I had ever heard it. "It's worse than we thought." "Tell me," I demanded. Harrison didn't list the property on the open market. He bypassed the local agencies entirely. He's doing a direct private sale to an LLC, a corporate buyer. They've already signed a purchase agreement based on the forged deed. "Who is the buyer?" I asked, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. "What corporate entity?" There was a long pause. "Evelyn, the company is called Horizon Development Group." I pulled the corporate filings from the Secretary of State's office. "The primary registered agent, the owner of the LLC." Constance took a breath. "It's Richard Vance." The name hit me with the force of a freight train. Richard Vance, Jessica's father. The room tilted again, but this time the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening, devastating clarity. This wasn't just about Harrison's tech stocks or his margin calls. This was never just a desperate son trying to save himself from bankruptcy. This was a calculated, long-term corporate acquisition. Richard Vance was a notorious, ruthless commercial developer in Austin. He bought up agricultural land, rezoned it, and paved it over for strip malls and high-density subdivisions. He had been trying to get his hands on the acreage around Oak Creek for a decade, but Arthur had always refused to sell. Jessica hadn't just been pushing Harrison because she was afraid of losing her country club status. She had been acting as an agent for her father. They had orchestrated the debts. They had orchestrated the pressure. They had gaslighted me, threatened me with a psychiatric ward, and finally resorted to felony forgery, all to feed my 50 acres of prime Texas real estate directly into Richard Vance's concrete empire. Harrison wasn't just a traitor to his mother. He was a pathetic pawn in his father-in-law's game. "When is the closing?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, sounding like a stranger's in my own ears. "Friday," Constance said. 3 days from now, 10 a.m. at the title company in downtown Austin. They're rushing it through before you can untangle the forgery. "They think they are," I corrected her. "Evelyn, we need to file for an emergency injunction," Constance urged. "We need to drag this into a judge's chambers tomorrow morning and stop that closing." "No," I said, a dangerous, thrilling calm washing over me. "No?" Constance echoed, shocked. "Evelyn, if that sale goes through to a third-party corporate entity, getting the land back will take years of litigation. You could lose the orchard." "Constance," I said softly, looking out the window at the rows of pecan trees standing tall against the Texas sun. "If we file an injunction now, Harrison and Richard Vance will just lawyer up. They'll bury us in paperwork. They'll claim the forgery is real. They'll tie up my assets, and they'll drag me through the mud for the rest of my natural life. So what are you proposing?" "I am proposing we let them think they've won," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I am proposing we let them walk right into that closing room on Friday morning. They want to play corporate espionage with my home? Fine, we will play, but we are going to burn their house down while they're sitting in it." "Evelyn," Constance said slowly, a mix of warning and deep, profound respect in her voice. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I need you to contact the Texas Department of Public Safety," I instructed. "Specifically, the division that handles felony real estate fraud. And then, Constance, I need you to buy a new suit, because on Friday morning, we are going to a closing." Thursday passed in a blur of calculated, quiet fury. While Constance moved like a shark through the back channels of the Texas legal system, pulling favors and filing sealed affidavits, I had my own work to do at the farmhouse. If we were going to walk into a room full of corporate lawyers and accuse my own son of a felony, a microscopic ink hesitation wouldn't be enough for an immediate arrest. I needed the smoking gun. I took the stepladder out of the pantry and climbed up into the sweltering heat of the attic. The air up there was thick with dust and the smell of old pine. I navigated through boxes of Christmas ornaments and Arthur's old hunting gear until I found what I was looking for, a heavy steel lockbox shoved deep beneath the eaves. I broke the padlock with a heavy hammer. Inside, resting on a bed of old newspaper, was the vintage brass autopen machine. It was a heavy, archaic piece of equipment, a relic of a time before digital signatures. And there, still locked into the mechanical arm, was the etched metal template of my signature. I ran my thumb over the raised grooves of the Evelyn A. Sterling plate. Harrison had been lazy. He had broken into the house, likely using the key I had so foolishly let him keep, sneaked into the attic, run the blank quitclaim deed through the machine, and shoved the heavy contraption back into the box without dismantling it. He thought I was too old, too blind, and too stupid to ever find out. I carefully placed the heavy machine into a canvas tote bag. It weighed a solid 20 pounds, but as I carried it down the stairs, it felt like the lightest burden I had ever borne. Friday morning broke with a brilliant, blinding Texas sun. I did not dress like a grandmother going to a garden party. I dressed like a woman going to war. I put on a tailored navy blue Saint John knit suit, the same suit I had worn 20 years ago when Arthur and I had stood in a bank lobby and proudly paid off the final note on our first piece of commercial farming equipment. I pinned Arthur's antique sapphire brooch to my lapel. I pulled my silver hair back into a severe, immaculate twist. I looked in the mirror, and the woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was the executioner. Constance picked me up at 8:30 sharp in her black Lincoln Town car. Sitting in the back seat with her was a man in a sharp gray suit. He had the hard, flat eyes of a man who spent his life untangling the lies of desperate people. "Evelyn, this is Investigator Miller," Constance introduced us as I slid into the leather seat. "Texas Department of Public Safety, Real Estate Fraud Division." "Mrs. Sterling," Investigator Miller said, nodding respectfully. "Attorney Hayes briefed me on the timeline in the corporate shell game Mr. Vance is running. We ran a quiet background check last night. It turns out Richard Vance's LLC has been under the state's radar for suspicious zoning acquisitions for a year. If your son used a forged deed to facilitate a fraudulent transfer to Vance's company, this isn't just a family dispute. It's organized corporate fraud. I have the machine he used to forge the signature, I said simply, patting the heavy canvas tote bag on the floorboard. The template is still attached. Investigator Miller raised an eyebrow, a rare flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic face. He looked at Constance. You weren't kidding. She really doesn't mess around. I told you, Constance said with a grim smile. Drive. The title company was located on the 30th floor of a glittering glass skyscraper in downtown Austin, a sterile monument to corporate wealth that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the rich, dark soil of my pecan orchard. We rode the elevator up in silence, the numbers ticking higher, my heartbeat remaining remarkably, coldly steady. When the polished steel doors slid open, Constance took the lead. She didn't bother speaking to the young woman at the reception desk. She pushed open the heavy, frosted glass doors of the primary conference room without knocking. Investigator Miller and I followed right behind her. The scene inside the room was exactly as I had pictured it. They were sitting around a massive, polished mahogany table that looked big enough to land an airplane on. At the head of the table sat Richard Vance. He was a large, florid man wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, projecting the arrogant ease of a man who always gets exactly what he wants. To his right sat Jessica, practically vibrating with triumphant energy, wearing a designer dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the morning light. And then there was Harrison. He sat across from his wife, looking haggard, gray, and exhausted. There was no triumph in his posture. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. Spread out on the table between them were stacks of legal documents, crisp and white, waiting for the final stroke of a pen. The sleazy notary, Thomas Davies, was sitting in the corner, nervously stamping his seal on the preliminary paperwork. Richard Vance was holding a gold Mont Blanc pen, hovering it over the final purchase agreement. I wouldn't sign that if I were you, Richard, I said. My voice cut through the quiet hum of the air conditioning like a gunshot. 5 heads snapped toward the door. Jessica let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Richard Vance froze, his pen hovering an inch above the paper. His eyes narrowed, taking in Constance and the unfamiliar man in the gray suit standing beside me. But it was Harrison's reaction that I will remember for the rest of my life. He didn't gasp. He didn't jump. He just slowly closed his eyes, and a single ragged breath shuddered out of his chest, as if the monster he had been running from had finally caught him. What is the meaning of this? Richard Vance demanded, his voice booming with practiced corporate outrage. He stood up, throwing his pen onto the table. This is a private closing. You are trespassing. Sit down, mister. Vance? Constance ordered, her voice cracking like a whip. She walked directly to the table and slammed a manila folder down on top of the purchase agreement. There will be no closing today, or any day. The property at 442 Oak Creek Road is currently held by the Sterling Family Living Trust and has been since May. Evelyn Sterling is the sole trustee and she has not authorized this sale. Jessica jumped out of her chair, her face contorted with panic. That's a lie. Harrison filed the quitclaim deed. We own it. The title search cleared it. The title search cleared a fraudulent document, Jessica, Constance corrected her coldly. It's a valid deed, Richard Vance roared, pointing a thick, aggressive finger at Constance. It was signed in March. It predates your little trust. We have the notarized signature right here. I stepped forward. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint, frantic ticking of the Rolex on Richard Vance's wrist. You have a signature, Richard, I said, my voice eerily calm. But it isn't mine. I hoisted the heavy canvas tote bag onto the pristine mahogany table. The heavy metal clanged against the polished wood. I reached inside and pulled out the vintage brass autopen machine, setting it dead center among their fraudulent documents. This belonged to my late husband, I said, looking directly at my son. Harrison had opened his eyes. He was staring at this machine with a look of absolute paralytic horror. He used it to sign Christmas cards. The template attached to it is an exact mechanical replica of my signature. It is also the exact machine my son used to forge the quitclaim deed. I turned my gaze to the notary in the corner. Mr. Davies was practically hyperventilating, pressing himself backward into his chair as if trying to merge with the drywall. Mr. Davies, I said softly, did you actually witness me sign that deed on March 15th? Or did my son simply hand you a piece of paper and pay you a few $100s to stamp it? Davies stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. Investigator Miller stepped forward, flashing a gold badge that caught the fluorescent light. I am Investigator Miller with the Texas Department of Public Safety, Fraud Division. Mr. Davies, you have the right to remain silent, but I highly suggest you don't. Perjury and notary fraud in the facilitation of a felony property theft carries a minimum sentence of 5 years in a state penitentiary. Did Evelyn Sterling sign that document in your presence? Davies broke instantly. He burst into tears, a grown man sobbing into his hands. No, she wasn't there. Harrison brought it to me. He said it was just a family transfer, that she was sick and couldn't make it to the office. He gave me $500. I swear to God I didn't know it was a corporate buyout. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The corporate shield had shattered. The lie was laid bare on the table, ugly and undeniable. You stupid, incompetent fool, Richard Vance hissed, turning a look of pure, venomous hatred onto Harrison. You told me the deed was clean. You told me the old woman signed it willingly. Harrison looked at his father-in-law, his face utterly devoid of color. You told me to get at the property, Richard. You said you didn't care how I did it. You promised if I got the land, you'd cover my margin calls and clear my debts. I don't know what you're talking about, Vance lied smoothly, immediately shifting into self-preservation mode. He backed away from the table, raising his hands. This is a family dispute. Horizon Development Group acted in good faith as a third-party buyer. If the deed is forged, we are victims of fraud as well. Nice try, mister. Vance, Investigator Miller said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. But we've already subpoenaed the text messages between your daughter and your son-in-law. You directed this acquisition. You provided the legal loopholes. The district attorney is very eager to speak with you about conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder exploitation. Jessica screamed, a shrill, panicked sound, as Investigator Miller moved toward her father. Daddy, call the lawyers! Harrison, do something! But Harrison didn't move. He sat perfectly still in his leather executive chair. He looked at Richard Vance, the man who had used him as a disposable tool. He looked at Jessica, the wife who had threatened to leave him if he didn't rob his own mother. And finally, he looked at me. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. I lost everything. I lost the tech stocks. I'm bankrupt. Jessica said if I didn't get the land to her father, she was taking the kids. I was desperate. Please, Mom. He wasn't acting anymore. The manipulation was gone. He was just a broken, ruined man begging for salvation from the one person he had tried to destroy. I looked at my son, and I felt a profound, bottomless wave of sorrow. Not for the man sitting in front of me, but for the little boy who used to run through the pecan orchard, laughing in the summer sun. That boy was gone. He had traded his soul for the approval of a woman who didn't love him, and a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Desperation is not an excuse for cruelty, Harrison, I said, my voice steady, though my heart ached with a heavy, final grief. You didn't just try to take my money. You tried to make me believe I was losing my mind. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. You tried to steal my dignity. I can fix it, he sobbed, reaching a trembling hand across the table toward me. I'll do anything. I looked down at his outstretched hand, but I did not take it. You can't fix this, Harrison, I told him gently, the finality of the words sealing his fate. Some roots are too rotten to be saved. You have to pull them out. I turned away from the table. Behind me, I heard the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around Richard Vance's wrists. I heard Jessica wailing, her pristine country club facade entirely destroyed. And I heard the low, devastating sound of my son weeping into his hands, entirely alone in a room full of people. Constance put a hand on my shoulder. We're done here, Evelyn. Let the state handle the trash. I nodded. I picked up my purse, adjusted the sapphire brooch on my lapel, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The elevator ride down to the lobby was quiet. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the blinding glare of the Austin morning. The heat hit me instantly, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a baptism. 3 months later, September arrived, bringing the first crisp edges of autumn to the Texas hill country. The pecan trees in my orchard were heavy with a bumper crop, the branches bowing toward the earth, rich and full. The air smelled of roasting nuts and dry leaves. The aftermath of that day in the conference room had been swift and brutal. Richard Vance was indicted on multiple federal charges of conspiracy and corporate fraud. His empire was currently being dismantled by the IRS. Jessica, facing accessory charges, had immediately filed for divorce and fled to a state without extradition, leaving Harrison behind. Harrison was currently awaiting trial for felony forgery. I did not post his bail. I did not hire him a lawyer. I let the consequences of his actions fall squarely on his own shoulders. It was the hardest thing I had ever done as a mother, but it was the only way he would ever learn. I established a secure, ironclad educational trust for my grandson Leo, managed exclusively by Constance, ensuring that the boy would have a future untainted by his parents' greed. I was sitting on my back porch, a cup of hot black coffee in my hands, watching the groundskeeper start up the old green tractor for the harvest. My life was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely silence of a widow waiting for her son to call. It was the deep, resonant peace of a woman who had defended her kingdom and won. The phone rang inside the house. I let it ring. If it was important, they would leave a message. I took a sip of my coffee, leaned back in my rocking chair, and looked out over the 50 acres of my husband's legacy. The roots were deep, the soil was rich, and the orchard, finally, was entirely my own.